if you go from cognitive load theory, we know that there's a certain amount of space in our working memory. Yeah? Short-term memory, working memory. And if we're busy trying to learn something, we have three different types of load on our working memory. I will try, for example, I will give a PDF of this. Okay, and so I'll send it to Laura, and then you can get it from her, the PDF of this presentation. So you'll have those types of things, and it's also being videoed. One part of it's called intrinsic load. That's the load that the problem itself has, the task itself has. And that is determined by two things: how complex is the task and how much of an expert are you. It's that simple. How complex is the task? That's determined by two things: the number of elements in the task and how the elements interact with each other. That determines complexity. You can get a very objective measure of complexity based upon that. I'll give you an example. I love examples. Let's say you're trying to learn to play the piano. Okay? And I teach you 3 notes. Those 3 notes, C, D, E, have a certain number of elements, 3, and not very complex because it goes in this order: 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Not very complex, not very much interaction. If I then try to teach you what the scales, that's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, that's more complex. Why? Because there are more elements, and you have to use more fingers to do that. Okay? Simple. Okay? But it's more complex than the 3. Okay? Now, if I give you a piece of music to play that's based upon this scale, the C scale or the F scale, it's even more complex because it has the same number of notes, but the interaction between the notes is not only do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, and back and forth, but it's different, first fa, so, do, la, si, in a different order, and in often a different tempo, and how hard you do it. So we've now added to the complexity order, hardness, and volume. Okay? So that's more complex. And if you are a piano student, the first 2 things are not very complex, and the third might be if it's a new piece of music from Chopin. If you've played it, it's no longer new, and it's not very complex. So expertise is the other thing that determines how complex something is. If you then play the Goldberg variations from Bach after listening to Glenn Gould, that becomes very, very complex. Okay? Even if you're a good pianist, to try to play it the way Glenn Gould did it. Okay? And you can fall back on routines that you have, but those routines often don't always work. They can lead to mistakes. Okay? That's the intrinsic load. Okay? That's the load of the task itself based upon complexity. Then we have germane load. Germane load is useful load. That which we have to do while we're learning that helps us learn. Okay? So those instructional design techniques that are beneficial for learning. And we have something called extraneous load, and that is non-useful load. That's load that doesn't help us to learn. Things like searching strategies, weak problem-solving methods. They don't help us learn. We carry it out, but they're not beneficial for learning. That's searching. Searching for information on the web is not beneficial to learning. Having it and finding it and knowing how to use it helps us learn. If the problem is so complex that searching, that extraneous load becomes so large that it's larger than your working memory, because you still have the germane and the intrinsic, that's on the complexity of the task itself, and things that are helpful for learning. If the extraneous load is so large that it exceeds the bucket that's called your head, the water will flow out of it, and you won't learn, or won't learn effectively or efficiently. And what you want to do with instructional design, you can't do anything about the intrinsic load. It's there. What you want to do is you want to increase the germane load, that which is beneficial for learning, and decrease the extraneous load, so that it all fits in your head, in your working memory. It's that simple. That's cognitive load theory. And the things you can do. For example, if you're dealing with something on a website or in a book, you should put the information that you need for reading the schema in the schema itself. Yeah, that's called the split attention effect. If the schema is here and here's the thing about it, my attention is split, that it won't be good. I'll have to constantly go back and forth. So that is extraneous load. Germane load is if within the thing with triangles and things you put the information where it should be, right next to the triangle or the angle in the triangle, you don't have this split attention effect, so you've reduced the extraneous load, having to go back and forth. In my time, it was called a reinstatement search. You read this, you had to go there, went back, oh yeah, where was I busy here? You read that, oh yeah, what did they say there? And you go back and forth. If it's next to each other, it works better. It's called the spatial split attention effect. You also have a temporal split attention effect. Present something in time as close as possible, the explanation as close as possible to when it's presented, the thing is presented, because the more time that's between it, the more time you have to try to rehearse it and keep it in your short-term memory, and you will have less learning. So what you do is with the temporal split attention, you put it next to each other, you increase the germane load, and you decrease the extraneous load. Those are the ideas. This redundancy effect, what I told you about reading your slide, don't do it, put something different in your slide than what you're telling, like I do here. And what you'll do is you'll make sure that what Pavio talked about, the two different memory stores that you have, a spatiotemporal sketchpad and a, let's call it a verbal memory and a pictorial memory, yeah, the visual sketchpad and the semantic memory, that you'll make use of both areas, both parts of your cognitive architecture if you do it in two things, and the chances are that you'll remember it better. Okay? That's what cognitive load theory is about. If you want to read more about it, read this article of mine. I can send it to Laura. You can also find it on the web. At this moment, I'm very proud of this. It's just about the most cited piece of research or article on educational science. It's led to a follow-up in which 3 people tried to attack it, and we had the chance of replying to that in a following number of educational psychologists. And based upon this article, there's now a book that will be presented at AERA. It's a presidential address this year. Based upon this article from Sig Tobias and Tom Duffy, I'm one of the authors. John's an author, and Dick is also an author in this book. And that'll be a presidential session at AERA. So I'm very proud of this. But this is why minimal guidance from 3 different viewpoints actually doesn't work. Okay? And I can also send that to Laura as PDF. Okay? The second aspect of discovery learning that I want to talk to you about is from the point of view of expertise. Discovery learning is ineffective and inefficient and often not even pleasurable, because you often get very frustrated if you find the wrong things or don't find the things. So the idea of it'll increase motivation is also it'll increase motivation until the learner sees or experiences that he or she hasn't learned properly and gets a bad grade or doesn't solve the problem. And then it doesn't become more pleasurable either, and the motivation also goes down. So every time everybody says motivation only works if it's positive. It can also be very negative. Expertise. I have this picture there for a certain reason. Almost everything we know about expertise started in 1946. There was a Dutch psychologist. His name was A.D. de Groot. Americans call him de Groot, G-R-O-O-T. And he did research on how expert chess players think. And he wrote his thesis on this. He eventually wrote it also in a book in English, but before he wrote it in a book, I don't know if you know of Newell and Simon, that's the textbook in cognitive psychology. Herb Simon is a Nobel Prize winner. He learned Dutch to be able to read this thesis. Okay? So all of the research based upon all of the Newell and Simon, because that's where, in English language areas, people start to talk about expertise and expertise research and how experts think. It's based upon Newell and Simon, and Newell and Simon based this on A.D. de Groot. If you were talking about the 10 most important psychologists in the world, he would be one of them. And I'll talk to you a little bit about him in a second, but that's why this is here. It's how experts think. Luria, in the 1930s, said the following: the incorrect belief that children and adults differ only in quantitative terms has become firmly entrenched in our consciousness. This is pictures he asked of a woman to make a picture of a child and an adult. And as you can see, even this primitive woman had the child as a little person, a little adult. And you also see that in paintings from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that the child is a little adult. Okay? And Luria said they don't. Its proponents argue that if you take an adult, make him smaller, him, it was 1930, we weren't into non-sexist language, somewhat weaker and less intelligent, and take away his knowledge and skills, you will be left with a child. Not only does our child think and perceive the world differently from an adult, not only is his logic founded on special, qualitatively different principles, but even his bodily structure and functions set him apart to a large extent from the adult. So a child is not a little adult. And this idea of discovery learning is based upon the idea of the way that an expert learns. An adult learns is by discovering things, if we look at the scientists. So that means the pedagogy should be based upon exploration and discovery. But they forget that a child thinks differently. And we also know that from Piaget. I mean, a child thinks, if I do this in front of it, and a 2-year-old child says the bottle doesn't exist anymore. That's called object constancy. A child's conception of number is completely different. If you have 5 stones that are next to each other, or 5 stones spread out, they'll say there are more stones when they're spread out than when they're next to each other. So it's not only that they know little, they can count to 5, they see the world differently. So if we make these web quests and make these discovery learning environments and expect for the children to be able to think abstractly and abstract different things out of the thing, you have to realize that a child can't think abstractly. A child gets that after the concrete operational stage. And it doesn't matter if it's 14 or 16 years. I'm not going to say if there's a definite cutoff point. But we know that children cannot think abstractly. They think very concretely. So any educational approach that you use, or pedagogical approach, that requires a child to think in abstract terms won't work. That's why most people don't understand the difference between weight and mass. Again, I'm going back to my history in the natural sciences. We taught children that when they were in high school. And nobody can understand that. They still don't understand why we have these two words, why we have weight and mass. And the reason is very simple. You always have mass, but weight is based upon gravity. So what we did as human beings living on Earth is we said, on Earth we call gravity 1. Yeah, we give it the value 1. That means on Earth our mass is the same as our weight. My mass is 71 kilos, and my weight is 71 kilos. In order to understand that, you have to understand that if you go to the moon, which is smaller, the gravitation is less, 1/6 of Earth. I don't have a mass that's now 1/6 of 72, of 12, but I do have a weight of 12 kilos. If I get on a scale there, my weight will be 12. But if I lie in water, I will displace 72 kilos of mass in that water. That's the difference. If I go to Jupiter, which is much larger, I will weigh 12 times as much as here, so I'll weigh 792 kilos. But my mass will still be 72 kilos, because on the scale there it will say 792, but if I get in a bath of water, I will still displace 72 liters of water, which has a mass of 72 kilos. It's that simple. Do you have any idea how abstract that is? And no child understands that. And if we try to have them discover it, they'll understand it even less. And that's why physics for children is so hard, because we ask them to really understand it, to think abstractly, and they can't. But we ask them in a WebQuest environment or in some type of simulation to abstract the rules of velocity, acceleration, force, and mass. Okay, excuse me, but no. But it's not only the fact that children are different. We know that from Piaget, we know that from Vygotsky, we know that from Luria, but it's also that experts think differently than beginners. It's that simple. The way experts think is not the weak means-ends solution, but they work from an end back to what they have. And they don't work step by step forwards. They have a backward chaining solution status. They have an incredible amount of knowledge in which to place the things that they see. A chemist walks into a room and sees things bubbling and looks at it and says, oh, they're distilling that and that because they're making use of a water bath, and that means that the maximum temperature can be 100 degrees, which means that the vapor point has to be below 100 degrees, so it's probably something with a high etheric value, and seeing the color, it's this and that, and knows all of that, just looking in and glancing at it. Okay? Doesn't discover anything, or you can say discovers, says, okay, it's either ethanol alcohol or methanol alcohol, seeing the temperature. That's what it is. You put a novice in there, they don't even know that it's a distillation thing. They don't know what to see. So they work forward and they look, and they don't know where to look. And what we do with this discovery learning is we transplant the epistemology of the expert, one who knows, and how one who knows gains new knowledge, to the novice, the person who is learning. Okay? So the scientist does scientist. The learner learns science. There's a complete difference. And this is all based upon, it's something that happened in 1956. It's called the Sputnik. And the Russians sent this Sputnik into space. And the Americans got a heart attack. And they immediately said, we have to change all of our education. We have to train scientists and engineers. And you got the biological curriculum science studies, BSCS. You got the physical science studies curriculum, PSSC. You got chem studies. You got all of these new curricula based upon this idea that if scientists do science by discovering, the best way to teach children science is by having them discover and explore. And all of the research done on whether or not that's the case has shown that it was a failure. They say the worst thing that we ever did in the 50s and the 60s was change the curricula to do this, because it just doesn't work. Children don't learn in that way. You can't transplant the epistemology of the expert to the novice. In other words, a child is not a dumb, smaller adult. And a novice is not a dumber, smaller expert. A novice sees different things. Load did studies on eye movements and eye tracking and saw that even by piano tuning and things like that, novices look at larger, more salient things. Experts look at smaller, more consequential things. Yeah? In other words, the epistemology, which is what discovery is, of the scientist is not the same as the pedagogy for becoming an expert. And I'll give you an analogy on this, and by analogies, everybody says, yeah, sure, and then I say, now go back to learning something else. If the epistemology of driving a car is Alonso in the Formula One, then what those people who say discovery say is you should teach people to drive a car by putting them on a Formula One circuit in a Formula One car, because that's the way the experts do it. I mean, the best drivers in the world are the Formula One drivers. So let's use the epistemology of the expert. Okay? But I don't think any of you think that that's the best way to learn to drive a car, putting someone in a Formula One car. It is stretching the point, yeah. But that's the epistemology of the expert, and I think the pedagogy that we should use to teach drivers is a little bit different. Yeah.
But the problem we have, at least the problem I have, is that adult learners, some adult learners
Yeah.
reject my my teaching them, and would prefer to plunge on the water,
Okay,
drive a
true.
Formula One car without having any training, and they would
I agree with you.
experience or discovery. Rather, that's my problem.
I know, I understand it. That's Gaby Solomon in the 1980s, when there was a lot of research done on aptitude treatment interaction by Cronbach and Snow, called it trait treatment interactions. And he said there are preferred learning styles. But what he said is a preferred learning style is not always the best learning style. And our job as educators is to be prescriptive. Okay? There are, if you're a doctor, we had an actress in the Netherlands, her name was Sylvia Millekam. Her preferred way of dealing with cancer was to go to a faith healer, and she died very quickly because she didn't seek treatment. That was her preferred way of doing it. The preferred, I will go into it second, no, maybe I'll go into it now. Dick Clark in 1989 wrote an article and presented at Early an idea called mathemathantic effects. In order to have you understand that, I'll go back a number of years before that to Ernie Rothkopf working at Bell Laboratories, and he spoke of mathemogenic behaviors. Mathema is knowledge, genese is birth, mathemogenic activities are those activities which give birth to learning. And he was doing research on questions in text. And he said that certain types of questions have this mathemogenic, or certain things that you can do at all, but he was dealing with questions in text, have this mathemogenic quality. And that's by asking certain types of questions, you can get people, while they're reading, to read in a certain way and think in a certain way so that it will give birth to a certain type of learning. Very crudely said, if you ask all factual questions, you will teach them to read in a factual way. And if you give them all application questions, they will learn while they're reading. They'll think about, how do I apply this which I'm learning? And if you give them evaluative questions, they will evaluate it. And he did research, very good research, with questions before a text, with questions after a text. They were called adjunct pre-questions and adjunct post-questions. And he talked about that. And David Auscherbel did that with advanced organizers, that those would have a mathemogenic effect. And people did research on all different types of things and how that affected how we studied and learned. And what Dick Clark said in '89, based upon all of the aptitude treatment interaction research, is you also have mathemathantic effects. And those are things which kill learning. Thanatos. Yeah? Mathemathanatos. And that held in the following. For example, let's say we have two people. Okay? Elena is someone who's very structured and organized. And one of her qualities is that if I give her a lot of information that she has to discover, yeah, things in, she will, and she'll find the connections and be able to make a good map and understand it. But if I asked Elena what she preferred, she would probably prefer something that's very ordered. Yeah? Because people who are ordered tend to like things that are neat and tidy and ordered. So she would prefer to get something that's nicely organized and things like that. And what would happen? I'd give Elena the information in a very ordered way in which she likes very, very much. And she'd learn from it. If I gave her a test after that, probably. But the question is, would she have learned more if I gave her something that wasn't ordered at all, what she didn't prefer, that she had to discover, make use of her qualities, because you probably have to process that information deeper. And she'd probably learn more deeply and more actively. So you could say it's not much of a problem. She learned what she had to learn, but she could have learned more. I killed a certain amount or type of learning. Now let's take Paul. Paul doesn't know what's in front or what's behind. He's not very good in organizing things. And where does he feel best in situations that aren't very organized? Because as soon as it's very organized, it's like the teenager that doesn't feel well if the room is clean and ordered. Okay, prefer to be in a place where everything's lying around and stuff like that. If you give that type of person something that's not organized, they'll go in all directions and they probably won't learn anything, although it's their preferred style or strategy. It is mathematic. You should probably give that person a very ordered thing because that person doesn't have the quality of being able to organize things. So I agree with you, it's a problem. The question is, then as instructional designer and teacher, how do you design your education in a way that will not be mathematic for the learner, although the preferred style of learning is probably mathematic, which means you have to give, maybe not stand in front, but give a lot of guidance and support in that discovery process. Start with worked out case studies in which you not only say what the person would do to solve the problem, but why, how the person thinks about it. Then go to worked out examples, and then to partially worked out examples, then process worksheets until you reach the stage where they can do it without support and guidance. I'll give you a book later that tells you exactly how to do that.
Excuse me, but doesn't that mean that the learning process is done very personal?
Yes.
And that we cannot make any programs, let's say, for a group, and then we reach the point that it's too expensive?
Yeah, you're completely right. Learning is very personal. That means, as Voltaire would say, in this best of all possible worlds, it should all be individualized. But that's not a possibility. So you have to look for an optimization strategy. You have to...
Does that mean that we should, let's say, make groups with...
you could,
Let's say some kind of a psychological test, and then we say...
That could be.
All Elenas and Pauls together, and...
That could be. You could make instruction that's partial, that's adaptive. You could make things that if you go through it in this way and you're done more quickly, then the next piece will be done in a different way. Yeah, making use of different techniques. And as we get more electronic and the possibility of becoming more adaptive and creating adaptive environments, the question is only what do you adapt? What are the theoretical backgrounds for how you adapt? I mean, you can really get if people say learning styles, I immediately go like this, because I say, well, we have field dependent and field independent, we have this, we have that. And if all of the 8 different aspects of the learning styles are dichotomous, I have 2 to the 8th different learning environments. So I don't deal with learning styles or things like that, I deal with teaching styles. Yeah, and then you can say there are a number of them and we can make adaptive. Yeah, you're completely right. There is I can't solve the problem and say do it this way or do it that way, because it's neither giving everybody the same thing or giving everybody something different. Because as a teacher you can't control it anymore and we're in a teaching learning situation. So it's an optimization strategy. These are some differences between experts and novices. You don't have to write them down. I won't go through them because, as I said, I don't read my slides. But on the left is how the experts do things, and on the right is how novices do things. And I often give this as an example when my geologist friend goes in the Pyrenees or in the mountains in France, he sees what's on the bottom, this part, and sees geological time periods and things like that. I'm a bicyclist. When I climb the Mont Ventoux, I see completely different things. What you know determines what you see, and not the other way around. So experts see, in different fields, see completely different things. In other words, I haven't used this word very much yet, I do say that constructivist philosophy has a basis, and that is that we all construct our own reality and see things differently. My problem is mapping the constructivist philosophy as if it is a pedagogy, that we all have to construct our own knowledge and reality in order to learn. That's something different. That's, again, just like I said, the epistemology of the expert, putting that on as a pedagogy for learning. I have a problem with the making use of the constructivist philosophy as a pedagogy for teaching and learning, because it isn't. And anyone who writes down constructivist pedagogy has no idea what they're talking about, because it doesn't exist. What?
15.
Okay. Third is experiential learning. This is just something for me from why experience often isn't the best teacher. Yeah? The third is that we have to make it nicer, MTV generation. I call it the attention deficit hyperlink disorder. J.B. Solomon called it the Butterfly Defect. What it means is that children flit from one thing to another without having a good scheme of why they're doing it, which means they come across a lot of interesting things, but often not to the point and don't know where they are and get lost in cyberspace. And to give you an example of that, how that works, I know you work here with Macintoshes, but this is not a Macintosh. This is a Microsoft machine. I don't know how many of you have ever had a problem with Microsoft. I know that's not very many have that, but every once in a while you have a problem with Microsoft. And what you do is you hit the help function, F1, or you go to help, if you know that, and it brings you to a page, and first you have to think of what's wrong, because you have to search for a term. And eventually, after 6 or 7 mistakes, you find the right term, and it says, well, go to this page, and if you want to do that, click on this, and then you go to this page and click on this, and then you go to this page and click on this, and then change that. Okay? And you do that, and it works. And the next time, half a day later, or half an hour later, or half a week later, you have the same problem or a very similar one, and the only thing you know is what the search term is, because you had quite a lot of experience with that. But you have no idea how you solved the problem, because you don't have the scheme of what was actually wrong, but you just, as a butterfly, went from one flower to another until you solved it. And after doing that a number of times, you eventually know what the routine is and know where you should go. That's the butterfly defect. It's because we have fragile networks of knowledge and don't know it. This is in Dutch. I'm sorry, I'm going through it now a little bit more quickly. But what it actually, this cartoon is saying is someone sitting there, his name is Pickles, that means the thing you have on your face if you're pimples. He says, I only have 250 channels. I only have 8,000 songs on my iPod. I only have millions of online games. And he says, I'm understimulated today, to his mother. We tend, and I also see it here, but I see it at my own university and all the research that I see, we often see people saying, we have to use games because it stimulates and it motivates the children. Or we have to do research, we have to do this and this to make it more fun, more attractive. And I often say to the researchers or these game designers, I say to them, why don't you do research on why, as soon as we bring a game into the educational situation, it becomes unattractive? What's making us fail? Not how do we make it more attractive, what are we doing wrong that makes it less attractive? Because I know from my children that they work in teams. I often give an example of my youngest daughter who wanted to set up a party at school in her senior year. And the teachers didn't want them to do that. So they said, okay, you do it yourselves. We know it's going to fail. And they collaborated, collaborative learning. I mean, they really, and they learned things from it. They learned, for example, that if you don't number the tickets and say who got how many tickets, you're going to end up losing money on this and this. And if you don't make this, they learned a hell of a lot from it. Yeah? And they collaborated greatly. But so they can collaborate. But we tend to, as soon as we bring collaborative learning in school, we tend to kill it, and then we have to say, you have to send 3 emails to each other and go on the discussion board 5 times in order to take the examination. Which is absurd, because my kids communicate with each other the whole day at school, instant message and SMS each other, text message each other all the time, email each other, are constantly doing that. So it's really not necessary. What are we doing wrong that kills it? Okay? That's what we should be asking each other, instead of saying, how do we make it more fun, more attractive? Because as soon as we put the game in school, it becomes boring for some strange reason. And after doing the web quest twice, the third time is we have to do it again. Also, this idea that students are digital natives, so they learn better from things on screen. We know from the 80s, research on television and on books. Gaby Solomon, Bainches, Biggles-Ross, they all did this research on tough versus easy media. And we saw that though people preferred the television version, they learned more from the book version. And the reason was they found television easy and didn't deeply process, and they found books hard and did deeply process. So this idea of the digital natives, and so we should do it in the way that they're accustomed to, only means that we're reinforcing that butterfly defect and that superficial processing. And the idea of it's preferred, that's my major problem. I find myself as an instructional designer and educator, kind of like the idea of it's not to do what you want the most, but the way you learn as effectively and efficiently as possible. And I won't do it in a way, I will try not to do it in a way that you'll hate, but that doesn't mean I'll do it in the way that you want. And you have to find the balance in those things, because again, the idea, as you said, they prefer to do it in a certain way, throw me in the deep, that's great, until it's the day before the examination and they still haven't learned, and they come to you and they need tutoring or things like that in order to finally do it, or they fail the examination and they find that it wasn't that pleasurable either if they have to retake the examination because they didn't learn it. There's also a second problem, which I should get into with that problem-based learning, and that being able to solve the problem is not always the same as learning. So the measurement of did they solve the problem correctly, and you see that in a lot of research on problem-based learning, is not the same as did they learn the content properly. Yeah?
Perhaps the problem working with adults is that they won't enroll.
No, I know.
That's the big problem for me, because
Yeah.
I'm doing something I'd like to be able to present to you later on. And this is, I mean, this can't be compulsory because it's cross-curricular.
Yeah,
And I'll offer it to students, but if they don't enroll,
I know. Yeah, I know. The question is, how do you find, especially in a distance education, so the WOC or the Open University, how do you find the balance between the two? Third is, another thing is just this absurdity that knowledge is as perishable as fresh fish. The gravitational constant is still 9.8 meters per second. Gaudi still lived from the 5th of June, 1852 to 10th of June, 1926. The Theorema from Pythagoras is still a squared plus b squared is c squared for a right isosceles triangle. I mean, those things exist. So the knowledge is, the difference is there's more information. And information is constantly being renewed. But you need the knowledge base to understand the information. I'll go into that in a second. And also, for me, the idiocy that there are no facts, the truth doesn't exist, we construct it all. We get certain things like this. The top thing's in English, the bottom's in Dutch. It's just two things. The bottom, Alan Sokal wrote an article for the best social constructivist journal in the world, in which he proved that gravity doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. It's a constructivist, construction of our mind. And he did that using all types of postmodernist and social constructivist jargon. And it was peer-reviewed by 2 people and accepted. And then afterwards he said, but it's all bullshit. Nothing, I mean, it's all I did was grab all of these terms and let you see how stupid you are because you accepted this type of thing. And the urban legend has it that he then afterwards, it was a whole big thing in science at that moment. He invited the peer reviewers and the editor to come to his office, which was on the 2nd floor, and to walk out of his window. Because apparently they also believed that gravity was a social, constructivist, postmodernistic concept, which actually didn't exist. And he dared them to prove that what he wrote in his article was actually true, because they had read it and accepted it for his journal. And you get a Dutch minister of education who says we should actually debate on whether or not intelligent design exists or creationism exists in natural science curricula. Finally, the locus of control, getting it to the individual. The idea behind that is if you want to bring control to the individual, the person has to be intelligent and also know what the thing is. Now, if you look at this man, and if you made this a little bit darker, you'd see he still has the goggles on his lenses of his thing. The idea, it's the blind leading the blind. Now, you saw what happened in America when the blind led the blind, or in America, in the economy, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and things like that. You now know where my political ideas are. But also a lot of very strong researchers such as Dave Merrill, who has this idea. He's an advocate of giving the locus of control to the learner, but he says the problem is that university and high school students aren't capable of making good use of the possibilities when you give them the locus of control. That Carrier says that students don't have the strategies to do that. They don't know what to look at. They don't know what to learn, and they don't know how to learn it. So giving the locus of control to them sounds really, really good, but it tends not to lead to things, and I spoke about the mathematic effects. And I'll give you an example of these 2 things together in the next slide. Let's say that your job is, as a student in a web quest, is to write in one of these Diana Kuhn postmodernist constructivist ideas. You have to write an essay on the scientific method based upon the ideas of Francis Bacon. Okay, it sounds very simple. And you can then go to the internet and find anything you want and how to do it. So you go to the internet, and what you're looking for is information on this person, so you can write it. But what you find is this. And because it's the internet, you will find quite a lot more on the British artist, Francis Bacon. And you know that they're both British, because you were told that they were British. So you find about this British artist who lived from 1909 to 1992, while you actually should have found something about this scientist. But yeah, we're in 2008, so you'll find 100,000 hits on the right and 10,000 hits on the left. So the chance that you'll find something about the left-hand Bacon is a lot less than the right hand. So you write this web quest based upon these things that you found about Francis Bacon. Now, it sounds like I'm making a joke, but a journalist actually wrote an essay in the newspaper, an editorial on the scientific method, based upon Francis Bacon and the one on the right, and not the one on the left. So this idea of it's all there, you can find it, set them in web quests, let them look for it themselves. It sounds great, but if you don't have this basis body of knowledge in which you can look at the information you got and see that it can never be about the scientific method in the Renaissance, if it was in 90, so you have to know what the scientific method is, so it's not going to be a painter. You have to know that the Renaissance was not in 1909, between 1909 and 1992, and it definitely had nothing to do with a painter. Okay? If you don't even know that, your web quest, so you have this body of knowledge you have to learn somewhere. And discovery and finding it out yourself isn't always the best way to do that. I mean, sometimes it's really nice to be just told. that the Renaissance was from this period to this period, and then you can look at the birth and death of someone and say, that person can't be the person I'm looking for. It must be another Francis Bacon. Now I'm going to go into the last thing. This is the newest hype that I want to make you, because it sounds all good, this newest hype of brain and neuroscience and brain-based research and what we all find with functional MRI and things like that. Be very careful, because fMRI and all this brain research, all it can do at this moment is bring about your thinking about relationships. It can't be used to prove anything yet. So it's what Francis Bacon calls gathering a lot of data and basing your hypotheses on that and then testing it. So we find things like, because the prefrontal lobe of children and adolescents hasn't been developed yet, because that's something that happens at like 18, 19 years old, they can't work in projects because they can't plan. Because the prefrontal lobe is for planning. And so you find these people now spouting those types of things, which is completely absurd, because you give them a planner and you help them plan, they can do it very well. What it says is that prefrontal lobe is that part of your brain which helps you understand the long-term consequences of short-term action. What does that mean? That means my son, who's 18 years old, who was 18 years old, will go snowboarding in a dangerous place, not because he's stupid or wants to tempt fate. It's because my son doesn't see the danger there, because his prefrontal lobe he thinks he's invincible. There was a song, "We Thought We Were Invincible." So it was a rock and roll song. That means if you have to make choices, you need a lot of help, a lot of support and guidance to make decisions that will affect you in the long term. For example, what courses should I do in high school if I later want to do this on the university? Because you will make your decisions based upon what's the most fun now and what do I have to do the least amount of work, which might not be the smartest thing to do. So you need a lot of support and guidance in doing that. That's the idea behind it. And now people are making use of brain-based research and neuroscience. Also say the same types of stupid things that other people are saying just based upon non-information. In closing, last thing, okay? These are two things that I think, if we're talking about children today and people today, adolescents, and how we should teach them, I think that we'll all agree with, or most of us. Not that it's always better, but kids today, they're like that. But then if I tell you that the first statement was from Socrates in 300 BC, and the second one was from Peter the Hermit in 1100 AD, we know that this has been the case for at least 2,200 years. So kids today aren't very much different than kids 2,200 years ago. So the idea that we need to change our education because kids today are so different than they were a generation ago. In English, I don't know if you say it in Spanish, say take that with a grain of salt. Kids today aren't that much different than kids were a generation or two or three ago. We still learn in the same way we've learned for the past 10,000 years. Our cognitive architecture hasn't changed very much. If you want to get some answers to your questions that I couldn't give today, I have a copy of the book with me. Go to the site, 10steps.info. I won't even say buy the book, because that sounds too much. Go to the site, read what others have said about the book. For example, they've said it's not, and we say it ourselves, Jeroen and I, it's not for making one lesson. It's for making a curriculum or a course, a whole course. We say it's not something that someone who's completely inexperienced in instructional design can do. You should have a bit of a background. It's a design approach, a systematic approach to design instruction. But If you want theory-based ideas about how to design instruction, which could be behavioral, could be cognitive, could be constructivist, can make use of books or internet, it doesn't matter. This might be a book for you. Oh, that's the wrong one. That should say, gracias. I don't know why I changed it here. I changed it on this. You were there. Okay. That's my seminar for today.